Good morning, everyone. Welcome to this morning's webinar presentation, Legal Issues Affecting Transgender and Gender Nonconforming Students in K-12 Schools. My name is Kathy Purdy, and I am a marketing manager here at Bond. I'd just like to go over a couple of quick housekeeping items before we get started. Please use the Q&A box located at the bottom of your screen to submit any questions, and our presenters will get to those as time allows throughout the program. Once the webinar has ended, if you would take a moment to complete the brief survey, we would appreciate it. Your comments and suggestions for future topics are helpful to our panelists. And today's panelists are Sarah Richmond and Ayanna Thomas, both members of the School Law Practice Group, and they're located in our Westchester office. So to start us off today, I'm going to hand it over to Sarah.
Good morning, everyone. Nice to have you all here this early in the morning for this very timely topic. Ayanna and I are going to talk sort of back and forth, and we really will welcome your questions and ideas because we know that this is an ever-changing area, rapidly changing, and something a lot of you are confronting all of a sudden in your schools, which you didn't necessarily have a year ago. Next slide. So we're going to start by sort of talking about some sobering statistics. 14% of middle and secondary schools identify as transgender, genderqueer, or gender nonconforming. LGBTQ students are more than 2 times likely to report having experienced bullying in school or harassment, and fewer than half of them reported feeling safe at school. Okay. There are also some studies that show that LGBTQ students, especially gender nonconforming students, have higher rates of suicide and self-harm than other students. But what has also been found is that if gay or lesbian or bisexual students had the same level of support as other students, that the disparities in their mental health, academic motivation, and academic performance in school would shrink by half. Disparities in school connectedness would disappear completely, and disparity for lesbian, gay, and bisexual students would lessen by 90 to 100%. LGBTQ students who had experienced discriminatory policies had lower levels of academic achievement, lower grade point averages, and lower levels of educational aspiration than other students. And they are more than 3 times as likely to have missed school in the past month because they felt unsafe or uncomfortable if they had experienced discrimination in their school. So as educators, while we're not going to be talking about philosophical or ideological ideas related to this, what we are talking about is the importance of keeping students safe in the school environment. And that's a charge that we believe all of you have and that we're here to help you with as well. And that a lot of these feelings of bullying, a lot of the disconnect that a lot of these students feel with school is preventable if certain basic supports are in place. Okay, so we're going to start by going over a glossary of terms because I know it's very confusing and it also changes. In the time since we put together this presentation and determined what the title of it would be, the phrase or the preferred phrase for gender nonconforming students has changed, and honestly, the preferred term is gender fluid rather than gender nonconforming. So it's just important to know that these names change. Okay, so we're going to talk about the glossary of the terms. Now, what we're not talking about, and this is a very basic distinction, is we're not talking about sexual orientation, whether someone is heterosexual, homosexual, bisexual, pansexual. Rather, what we're talking about is their gender identity, which is how they view themselves and how they choose to express themselves related to their gender. Okay. So those are 2 different things. So cisgender is a person whose gender identity matches the sex they were assigned at birth. So I would be considered, I'm a cisgender female. I was assigned a female gender and identity at birth. I identify as female. Non-binary, and this is a little bit more confusing, is a person who does not identify as either male or female. They might identify as both, neither, or non-gender. Okay, and that sometimes is a hard concept for people to understand and to sort of wrap your head around for those of us who are a little bit more traditional. But there are very many non-binary people in the world. Some people argue that someone like a David Bowie was a non-binary person. And, you know, had he been born in a different era, he might have identified as non-binary, which he did not. Gender fluid is someone whose gender identity fluctuates. They can feel at times like they identify more with one gender than the other. In different situations may identify as a different gender and are just have a more fluid. I mean, it's good to sort of think about this more as a continuum rather than as either side. Next slide. So these are some of the LGBTQ terms that you're going to run into. Lesbian is a term about sexuality. It's not a gender-related term necessarily. You could have a transgender man who identifies as a lesbian, a transgender woman who identifies as a lesbian, a cisgender woman who identifies as a lesbian, or a gender fluid person who identifies as a lesbian. It's sexualities as opposed to gender. Gay is a very broad phrase. It is most often associated with men, but broadly means a person who is sexually and or romantically attracted to people of the same gender. And again, that can be based on your gender identity or your gender identified at birth, assigned at birth. Bisexual is a person who is sexually and or romantically attracted to men and women. This can also be someone who is gender fluid and attracted to binary people as well. So it's a broader term. Transgender is more of a gender identity phrase, and is a person whose gender identity does not correspond to the gender they were assigned at birth. And a questioning person is a person who is unsure about their orientation and or gender identity. And that's something that you may encounter more frequently in school, and especially in the pre-K through grade 12, and even, you know, younger grades as well, that there are children who are unsure about their orientation and or their gender identity and are trying to figure it out. And plus just means that we include all gender identities and expressions when talking about this. Just so you know, many of these terms are defined in DASA specifically. So that's a good reference point if you need some clarification on some of the terms when you're confronted with them. And then there are even more. There's LGBTQIAA2SPP, which is, as we said, or as I said earlier, this is an ever expanding or ever evolving area of not even of the law, but of identity for people. So queer is a term used to define any orientation that is not straight or a gender that is not cisgender. That applies to a lot of the terms we talked before. Intersex is when chromosomes or biological sex are not typical. That occurs a little bit more infrequently, but there are often situations where where sexuality or gender identity is not clear at birth, and a choice may be made to assign one gender or another to an individual that may or may not correspond to their gender identity later in life. Asexual is a sexuality term, lower absence sexual attraction. An ally is a person not part of the LGBTQ+ community, but who advocates for the rights of people in that group, or who is supported. An ally can be a friendly person who's there in school. It can be a very basic term. It can also be someone who is actually an advocate. Recently, there was some discussion of two-spirit people, an indigenous North American term meaning people who have the spirit of both men and women, a third gender. This is something that has been common in Native American culture for years. It's not a new, it didn't just evolve, it's always been there. Pansexual is people who are sexually attracted to other people regardless of their gender, and polyamorous is engaging in more than one sexual romantic relationship simultaneously. Now we're going to deal more with the gender issues. The sexuality issues are separate, and those of course are things you're going to encounter in the school setting as well. But for this purposes of this presentation, we're really going to be focusing on gender identity and the implications and the protections that are in place for students with non-traditional gender identities. And I'm going to now turn this over to my colleague, Ayanna Thomas.
Good morning, everyone. So the next couple of slides, we're going to discuss which laws are in place to prohibit discrimination based on sex and gender. So we're going to walk through the four prominent ones so far. The first one is New York Education Law 3201-A, which prohibits discrimination based on admission and inclusion in course of instruction and athletic teams. And later on in PowerPoint's presentation, Sarah's going to talk about sports and gender identity. Next one is the most many may be familiar with DASA, Dignity for All Students Act, to protect students from harassment, discrimination based on sexual orientation, gender, which also includes gender identity and expression, or sex by school employees or students on school property at a school function. And as you know, DASA doesn't just cover gender and sex discrimination, but also covers other protected categories such as race. And just a quick note on race. DASA has been changed where race now includes protective hairstyles. We may actually do a presentation on that later in the future, but that's been a new change in the DASA definitions. Title IX. Title IX, as you know, prohibits discrimination on the basis of sex. And for those who are in education programs, federally funded education program activities. Although Title IX specifically says discrimination based on sex, the Department of Education has presented guidance to show that it also includes person's gender identity and transgender status as well. Also, on October 15, 2021, the New York Attorney General filed a brief in a case before the Second Circuit to advocate for transgender students, firstly in gender segregated sports. And that case is actually called Stoll versus Connecticut Association of Schools. In that case, the Connecticut Interscholastic Athletic Conference implemented a new policy allowing transgender students to participate in gender segregated sports according to gender identity. Once that policy went into place, it was for cisgender female students that brought a lawsuit against the conference. And some of their claims are that the participation of transgender students in gender segregated sports violates their rights as cisgender students. And they're saying that if transgender women are playing on sports teams with them, it creates an unfair advantage for them, an unfair competition where they're more likely to have a chance to win championships and have more access to scholarships and other honors regarding sports. So they're saying that their Title IX rights are being, the cisgender students are suing, saying that their Title IX rights are being affected. So that case is still pending. So if we do, we may have a blog post that keep everyone updated on the results of that case. But as I mentioned, the New York Attorney General and also other organizations have filed a brief in support to support transgender students in their participation in gender segregated sports. So Education Law Section 409-M is a new law that was passed on March 26, 2021, which requires school boards to develop policies and procedures regarding gender neutral single occupancy bathrooms. So basically, if a school has a single occupancy bathroom, it must create signage that says that it's gender neutral. And a single occupancy bathroom is defined as a bathroom intended for use by no more than one occupant at a time, or for family or assisted use, and which has a door for entry into an egress, and a bathroom that may be locked by the occupant to ensure privacy. So it's important that school boards adopt policies that says that all single occupancy bathrooms will now be designated as gender neutral bathrooms, and it's also appropriate signage on the bathroom door or at the entry of the bathroom to let everyone know that there are considered gender neutral bathrooms.
Okay, so gender-based stereotypes. We're talking now about how to protect gender-based students who are gender fluid or gender, as we call it, gender nonconforming. So there's a lot of misconceptions about this because transgender and gender expansive people don't have to do any of the following to be legally protected. They don't have to legally change their names. And I think that's a big misconception that a lot of people have. We see it a lot in the employment situation as well as with students, but the mere fact that a child or an employee or an adult wishes to be called by a different name in order to recognize their gender identity, they are entitled to that protection. They don't have to change their pronouns to be protected. It's not a consistency thing. They don't have to take surgery, have surgery or take medications, including hormones. And as Ayana said, I'm going to be talking about sports a little bit later, but it's very interesting to note that the International Olympic Committee just yesterday, I believe, released new guidance that said that they are not going to require transgender athletes to have surgery or take certain medications in order to compete in the sport consistent with their gender identity. That's a change for them. Transgender people don't have to dress in a certain way to be protected, and they definitely do not have to produce medical records verifying a transition. I think that's sort of an antiquated view that some people may have, but it's not something they have to do. When referring, this can be confusing as well. So when referring to a transgender person at a time in their lives before they transition, you still use their current pronoun or names. So Caitlyn Jenner went to the Olympics, not Bruce Jenner. Because from Caitlyn Jenner's perspective, Caitlyn Jenner was always Caitlyn Jenner. Caitlyn Jenner was known as Bruce Jenner, but Caitlyn Jenner was always Caitlyn Jenner. You don't ask for a person's former name pre-transition, and you never ask whether a person has had or will have a medical procedure or is on medication. These are just more courtesy, more supportiveness. Again, what we're talking about is how to keep people safe. Making a transition, changing your gender identity, changing your name is a big step for anybody. And we want to be as supportive as possible in this setting.
So now we're going to talk about pronouns at schools, and this is definitely the start of the hot topic and a lot of questions that come up and sometimes create a controversial subject, especially if there's parent opposition. So the first rule of thumb is every student is entitled to be addressed by the name and pronoun that corresponds with their gender identity. They do not need parental consent. They do not need a court order. They do not need a legal name change in order to be addressed by the preferred name and preferred pronoun. Also, all school staff members and students must refer to students by their chosen name and pronouns, and schools should create opportunities to confirm the correct information. So for example, if we have a student database system such as eSchools and Infinite Campus, and a student comes to you and says, I want to be referred by a new name, it's important that you use that database to update the student's name in the system. I know that some platforms have a section where it says nickname, where they can have a chance to put the student's preferred or chosen name. Also, it's a good tip to also put the student's preferred pronoun as well. This way, anyone who has access to that portal, they will know the student's preferred name and preferred gender. Some helpful tips is to use gender neutral terms whenever possible. So instead of using terms such as sir, madam, ladies, or you guys, use instead folks, people, students, scholars, everyone, or just simply say the person's name. Instead of using a pronoun or using another identifier to say the person's name, I think that's the safest way, especially if you're not sure of a person's identity, is to call the person by their preferred name. And also, if you're unsure about a pronoun, use one, ask the person how you like to be addressed. Also, if you ask everyone pronouns to use in a group setting, then no one is singled out. Like I said, the safest way is just to ask the person what is their name and refer to the person by their name.
And as far as the pronouns, I mean, I know for some of us, and I'll say me included, that generationally, the they, them is hard grammatically. We're not used to they, them being referring to a singular person. And it is something that we can struggle with. That you do the best you can, you apologize if you make a mistake, and you really try to use someone's preferred pronouns as often as you can. As Ayana said, a way to avoid that if you are uncomfortable with the they, them, is to refer to somebody by their name and not use a preferred pronoun. And that's something that, a workaround that you can do just for your comfort level. So Ayana mentioned some of the law related to gender neutral restrooms in schools. There's a lot out there sort of about, restrooms and safety and all that, but there's been no evidence that gender segregated restrooms are safer for women than unisex restrooms, okay? There has not been any report in the 18 states that have policies allowing students to use the restroom that aligns with their gender identity, that a trans person behaves inappropriately or has somehow infiltrated a women's restroom and caused some sort of sexual abuse or sexual harassment. If anything, transgender individuals are far more likely to be harassed or harmed in restrooms than any other gender identities. As you can see, we have a study in here that says that 70% of respondents, transgender respondents, said they were denied access, harassed, or assaulted in public restrooms. I think one thing to keep in mind is that anybody who's uncomfortable, if you have a gender neutral bathroom, anybody who's uncomfortable, whether it be a cisgender child or a transgender child, is entitled to use that gender neutral bathroom at any time. Again, we're talking about safety, but there is nothing that has shown that allowing transgender students to use the bathroom with their aligned with their identity has somehow increased the risk to cisgender students. Generally, transgender and gender expansive students must be provided access to facilities, restrooms, locker rooms, or changing rooms consistent with their gender identity asserted in school. They cannot be required to use a single gender facility that conflicts with their gender identity. So I know this comes up a lot in terms of locker rooms. You can put up curtain areas, you can, for everybody's privacy, because again, there may be cisgender children who are uncomfortable, as well as transgender children. And if there's a private space available for anybody who needs it, then you're going a long way to making everybody more comfortable in school and more safe. So there it says students must provide reasonable alternative arrangements for any student who expresses a need or desire for increased privacy. And that may be, as I've said, a cisgender student who is uncomfortable with a transgender student, or just even a cisgender student who wants privacy in a locker room in general. But that, in order to support students, again, you want to make them as comfortable in these situations. So you have to provide reasonable alternative arrangements for students.
So school form and records, I would say Sarah and I get a lot of questions about this on a daily basis, but some questions that come up are, one, what happens if there's parent opposition to a preferred name change or a pronoun change, or what records have to be changed, or what happens if a student changes their name on multiple occasions? These are questions that we get on I would say a pretty frequent basis, and we're going to try to handle some of those questions and throughout this presentation now. So first, as I mentioned before, if a student wants to change their name, there don't needs to be any legal change, there needs to be parental consent, and the district must use, school must use the student's chosen name and gender. But in some way of background, so there's been a July 2015 memo from State Ed, which addressed transgender students, and we haven't received any new guidance regarding that since the 2015 memo. So that's the starting point when dealing with forms and records. So the guidance says, first, there's like a huge paragraph under schools forms and records that says if a student comes to the school with a preferred name or chosen name or preferred pronoun, that the school should update all records as well to ensure consistency between the records and day-to-day interactions. And they gave a list of what's considered a record. So they said records include transcripts, report cards, and IEPs. As we'll discuss further, that can be a little bit problematic if there's parent opposition. So if there's no opposition from the parents, and to be consistent with the State Ed 2015 guidance, and the student comes with a preferred name and also a new preferred pronoun, you can update those records as long as there's no parent opposition. If there is parent opposition, things should be handled a little bit differently because parents have rights under FERPA to amend records. So you want to make sure that you respect the parents' rights under FERPA, because the parents have access and rights under FERPA, and the child doesn't have rights and access under FERPA until they turn at age 18. So if there is parent opposition regarding records being changed, you should have a conversation with the parent and student about that. And also, but still, you want to make sure you support the student in a school setting, and that should be the dean. Although the parent opposes a change in records, you want to make sure that the student is supported in a school setting. So for example, you can change the student's name on day-to-day records. And day-to-day records are things such as tests that students may take in class, or also if the student has particular login on Google Meets or Google Hangouts. Also could change the student's email address as well to make sure the student feels included in a school setting. But for records such as IEPs, transcripts, report cards, records that goes home to the parent, you should keep those records in the student's birth name. Like I said, these are only situations when there's parent opposition. Of course, like these cases may get a little bit more complicated. So it should be handled on a case-by-case basis. And of course, you can contact any Sarah and I or anyone in the school or practice group if you have a question regarding a change in records. But like I said, if there is opposition, you want to make sure that the student's well-being is supported in a school setting. And although their records may not be able to be, their official records may not be able to be changed, but you want to make sure that they feel comfortable and their day-to-day records are changed. And also, although there might be opposition, you want to make sure that you still refer to the student by their preferred name and pronoun, although there may be parent opposition. And also on the slide says a student's school ID card is not a permanent record. So yes, you also change that as well. And you wouldn't need parental consent, or even if the parent opposes to a school ID being changed, we wouldn't consider that a permanent record where they can oppose that request.
And we know that this is, this is difficult. This is, how do you keep the records? How do you keep them separate? Also, how do you ensure, especially in the situation where you do have a parent who does not approve, you can't necessarily ensure that the parent won't be aware that the child is using this name in the school setting. I mean, there may be a slip from another student may call and ask for a play date and say, can I play with Jason, whose birth name was Carolyn? So that can happen. And I think that's a discussion you have to have with the child. You try to involve the child and the parents when any of these happen, these changes are happening. But it's a conversation to have with the child as well, that you can't necessarily guarantee that this information, what they're known at school, will not be communicated to their parent.
And that's why it's important to, it's impossible to make sure that all school staff and teachers are aware if a student decides to change their name or change their gender. Because actually I had a client actually had a DASA complaint regarding this because a teacher didn't call the student by their preferred name and pronoun. So it does come up. So it's very important to be careful and make sure that the information is accessible when regarding any change in student's name or pronoun. Also, it's important if a student is new to the school, make sure, and they're using a chosen name, that their birth name is kept confidential and also in a secure file as well. So essentially you should have two files, like one file with the student's preferred name and gender, and also a file with the student's birth name as well. As I said, records for students' birth name should be kept in a separate and confidential file. And also the student has previously been known at school or school records by their birth name. The principal should direct school personnel to use the student's chosen name and not the student's birth name as well. So always, if a student presents a new name, always use their new name, their preferred name, and not their birth name. But also there will be a file set aside with the student's birth name.
Okay, so we know there are a lot of questions about medical records, right? Medical records are a little bit different because student medical records have to include a student's birth name and biological sex, because there may be situations where a transgender child still retains certain characteristics of their biological sex and may have medical information that's related to that as well. So school nurses and other licensed professionals need reliable information to ensure that students receive appropriate care and to coordinate student care with other health providers, as well as for things such as insurance claims, medical claims, that sort of thing. So what we would suggest is that nurses are legally required to maintain patient records that accurately document clinical information relating to their patients. And this should be kept in a separate file again, and we understand, every time we say separate file, I know the people who are responsible for keeping the separate file sort of flinch and say, this is more record keeping we have to do. But it is required that the nurse keeps a separate file. But still, the nurse should use the student's chosen name and when referring to the child, when talking to the child, and should only use the student's birth name when it's really necessary in order to provide appropriate care for the child. But yes, medical records are a separate category because it is necessary to retain a child's biological sex to ensure that they receive appropriate care, medical care. It may be necessary. So those are ones that should be kept separately.
In addition to filing health insurance claims, there also may be other agencies that require the student's birth name, like such as to obtain Social Security benefits or other type of benefits as well. So let's keep in mind, it's important to note that there are agencies that may request students' records in the student's birth name, although the student goes by a new name.
Okay, so forms and records, just generally, these are some things, just try to make them more inclusive. As you may or may not know, United States passports now have a gender neutral category that you don't necessarily have to check male or female. You can have other options, gender not included here, other use fill-in spaces instead of boxes so that students can self-identify. And then offer examples of the information of seeking, how may we address you? How would you like to be addressed? For a long time, people found the use of Ms. very troubling. It's now become in common parlance, but if you'd asked 30 years ago or 40 years ago, people would have found the use of Ms. very troubling, as I said. But think about why you want the information. So why is it important? As we said, health records may be different than school records, general school records. One of the things that Ayanna and I have talked about sort of in the past as we were brainstorming about this presentation was maybe the thing to be moving towards more is some sort of numerical identifier for students. So it wasn't name-based, it was rather number-based, sort of like a social security number or a student ID number. So if you had to cross-reference a child because of the way that they identified, you could refer to their student ID number as a way to find access to past records or other information. So it's something to think about, and I think that's going to evolve as well. That record keeping itself is going to become less gender focused and probably less name specific as this becomes a little bit more commonplace. So,
and also another helpful tip, this comes up on student enrollment forms or registration documents. Sometimes some schools may have where it says mother's name, father's name. Another alternative can be parent 1 and parent 2.
Correct.
That's also another way to make sure that it's inclusive and you don't have to identify genders.
Right, and there are all sorts of non-traditional arrangements, family arrangements, student all different that should be recognized.
So gender inclusive education would make sure, as the theme of this presentation is to make sure that students feel included and in a school setting. So you want to allow students to wear clothing associated with the gender identity that they conform with. And also you want to make sure that the dress codes are updated. Generally, we've noticed that from reviewing code of conducts in the dress code section where some of the language can be biased towards certain genders, so make sure that the language is neutral and applies to everyone. It doesn't discriminate against anyone by the clothing that they choose to wear. Also, you want to discipline students who refuse to use the correct gender pronouns or names. So make sure that there's repercussions for students or staff members that blatantly choose to use incorrect pronouns. Also, in addition to updating the code of conduct, I may also want to consider updating policies. I know that NISBA has been taking a mission to encourage schools to change their code of conduct policies to gender neutral language. So instead of referring to his or her destiny, say their destiny instead.
So Ayanna touched on sports, and honestly, sports And gender identity in sports is a whole different presentation, and a much bigger one. I actually sat in on one last week that was led by Chris Mosier, who was the first transgender Olympic athlete. He's a bicycler, and he is part of an organization about gender identity in sports. But the thing to know is that New York State is one of the 16 states and the District of Columbia that have trans-inclusive K-12 sports participation policies, which means that students should be allowed to participate with the sport, in the sport that aligns with their gender identity, not with their biological gender. The NCAA has allowed transgender students to participate in championship games in accordance with their gender identity since 2011. And the Olympics have allowed transgender athletes to perform since 2004 with their gender identity. And there's no evidence that the inclusion of transgender athletes has had an impact on sports participation or women's athletic achievement. We are not seeing transgender women dominating women's sports. It's just not, there's just no evidence of it. Women athletes, all different athletes have different bodies, have different strengths, have different sports abilities. And it just has not, the evidence is not borne out that we're seeing dominance by transgender athletes. And it's particularly transgender women. I don't think people are quite as concerned about transgender men, but non-transgender in women's athletics. Also, the same percentage of participation in sports has remained consistent. So there's no evidence either that having transgender women participate in sports has somehow reduced the involvement of cisgender women or girls. In fact, there is some evidence that having transgender athletes participate in women's sports has given more support to women's sports because there are more people who are included. The numbers are sort of statistically insignificant, but it is something to think about. But in terms of our overall idea, which is to keep students safe and supported in school, participation in sports is such an intrinsic and important part for many students of their development, of their sense of belonging in a school community, of their sense of self, that you really want to think about how you can encourage those children who are transgender or who are gender questioning to be able to participate in those beneficial activities, and the best way you can support them to do that.
So now we're going to some of our hypotheticals.
Do we want to look at some of the Q&A?
Oh, sure.
Yeah, why don't we look at some of the Q&A since we're sort of, because I know there are a bunch of questions.
Sorry, give us a second to get our mouse working.
Kathy, is there any way, Kathy?
Kathy, is there any way you can read us the questions in the Q&A?
Sure, I'd be happy to.
Thank you.
So the first question was, I read recently to use sexual identity instead of orientation because orientation tends to read as a choice.
It's gender identity, I would say yes. Orientation is more, I don't know that orientation speaks to choice. I think maybe that it's become perceived that way, but I would say identity. And I think that's more affirming to say identity.
Or expression.
Yeah.
Identity or expression.
I would agree with that.
Okay, and our next question is, often people will come back to registration at school years later and want a new transcript or diploma. What would you suggest in order to be sensitive while also needing to know the former name to look up the data? Would we keep both records? Is there a form you suggest using to have people fill out?
Well, Sarah mentioned that there's other neutral identifiers. So by asking the student's social security number, that's which is unique to everyone, you can use that information instead of asking for the student's former name. So maybe social security number, their date of birth, or of their student ID number if they have that in their possession. So it's other ways you can ask to figure out how to identify a student.
Some of these I think you've addressed.
Okay.
Yeah, I think that you've addressed all the other ones. Name changes in school nurses' medical records.
Right. And one thing that we do know and that we see in our practice on a daily basis is that these are very fact-based. You'll have if there are differences in the way you handle this between a child who's, grades pre-K through grade 5 than in a high school student. There may be different ways you deal with it. You also have to take into account family situations. You want to make sure whatever you do, that the child is safe at home as well. That's a big, that's important, and that's also a risk for some children. How it will be received at home if they do this, and having people who are aware of these issues and who are versed in them and comfortable dealing with them. The word ally that we addressed earlier is very important, to have allies in your community who can help these students, because it's difficult. It's a difficult issue for the students, it's difficult for the staff, it's difficult, for everyone. And it's, one of the things when why don't we should we do the example one?
Sure. So example 1, a student was introduced to you as Sam, comes to you and says, please call me Sarah and use the pronoun they for me. You comply. 2 days later, you get a call from Sarah's mother who tells you that Sarah is just going through a phase to get attention and that you're not allowed to indulge them. Sarah's mother tells you that if it continues to use Sarah's correct name, she'll report you to your supervisor. What do you do? So first, of course, as we mentioned throughout this presentation, if you must respect the student's name change. So although parents may oppose to having records change, if a student wants to be referred by a different pronoun or a different name, you must respect that change and also comply. So if the student says, please call me Sarah, you should call the student Sarah and not call the student Sam.
But on your official records in that situation, they would probably still remain as Sam until you got some sort of buy-in from the parent as well.
Yeah, so on a day-to-day records, you can use the name Sarah, but for official records, you use the name Sam.
Right, and when the child became 18 and they were the holder of their records under FERPA, they can move to amend the records if they had and change it. Right. Okay. Example 2, a student does not hand in her homework. When you ask her why she did not complete the assignment, she says that she was offended by the story she was assigned because the family in it does not look like hers, and it's discriminatory to make her write about a family that is not her own. The student has a prior history of making excuses for not doing her homework. What do you do? Well, first of all, I wouldn't assume that this was another excuse that the child was making. I would talk to the child and find out how she could write the story. You want to empower the child. You want to address the issues. If in fact the assignment makes the child uncomfortable because it doesn't look like her family, then that child should be supported in that as well. It's not necessarily discriminatory to make her write about a family that is not her own, but it might make her feel uncomfortable, and it might be a teaching method for her to teach her, okay, so then write about a family that reflects your own. Non-judgmentally, that will be there. This is a little bit less of a gender identity, more of a sort of discrimination case in general, but just remember that you're trying to be supportive, and just because this is a child who has a history of excuses, the reason they may not have done their homework in the past may be because there are many assignments that you're not aware of that were making her feel similarly uncomfortable. So it's just something to be aware of.
Exactly. There's so many other factors, especially now, like we notice that there needs to be more social emotional learning because students may have, suffered during COVID and because of their environments, and maybe they've been discriminated in their environment, maybe their home life is not great, where their parents are not comfortable with their new gender identity. So those other factors that should be considered when handling these scenarios. And Kat, are there any other new questions or anything else in the chat?
We did get one more question. If the parent is in agreement and we change the name and/or identity, how does that impact SATs, transcripts, and college boards?
The new name would be on the records that were sent for college transcripts, the SATs, and the because it would be a name change on their permanent records.
Yes.
Okay, and we also had a couple questions. Can we share the presentation?
Sure,
Okay.
absolutely.
And could you talk about working papers?
Oh, interesting. I haven't looked at them per se. Have you?
I haven't looked at that, but we could check to see whether that's one of the documents that requires the student's birth name. Because as mentioned before, there's certain documents, certain HCs for benefits purposes requires the student's birth name, but we could look into that. Yeah, that's a good question.
Okay, and that was our last question.
I think that's it. I mean, I think the most important thing is if you have a question, feel free to reach out to either myself or Ayana or whoever in our school law practice group that you deal with on a regular basis. As I said, these are rapidly evolving, and the questions, we can't all anticipate what all the situations and scenarios are going to be, but we do, want to work through them with you. And we anticipate that guidance will be updated. We know the Title IX guidance is going to be updated. We anticipate that at some point, State Ed is going to update their guidance as well. As Ayana said, the current guidance is 6 years old already, which is not very current.
Yeah, so each case should definitely be evaluated on a case-by-case basis.
And in the meantime, we would recommend updating policies to make sure they're gender neutral, also having procedures in place, for when students do identify that they want to be known as a different name or whose gender identity is different, has changed. Have procedures in place. Who do they go to? How do you go about informing people? How do you go about changing records? What do you do with that? I think that's very important to have in place. Okay. At this point, I think we thank you very much. We hope this was helpful. We know we were talking kind of quickly, but we had a lot to cover. But again, feel free to contact either one of us should you ever have any questions.
Thank you.
Thank you.